Gentlemen, having watched the documentary, I am kindly asking that we take a moment of silence. Colleagues, I'll ask you to stand for a moment of silence in remembrance of those who lost their lives on the 1st of August. Thank you very much. You can take your seats. My name is Justina Mukoko. I'm the current chairperson of the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum. And I have colleagues up here, Roslyn Hanzi, who's the executive director of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, Blessing Gorejena, who is the executive director of the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, and Dr. Norman Matara, who is a board member of the Zimbabwe Association of Doctors for Human Rights. I always get that confused, but I think I got it right today. And I think I will begin with Rose. Rose is a human rights lawyer, and she has vast experience in human rights work, representing a wide spectrum of human rights defenders who have faced injustice over the years. And Rose is going to be talking to us about emerging needs and legal framework to safeguard freedom of peaceful assembly and association to ensure non-recurrence of violations. So we'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Justina. And just to thank the conveners of this discussion, the Human Rights NGO Forum, and for the participants for coming to share with us these discussions. I just wanted to start off by saying I think the recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry were clearly articulated in the movie that we just watched, and there were about 6 of them. But of course, of concern was the fact that they were very vague recommendations. And today, I think we also need to reflect on whether there's been any implementation of those recommendations. But what comes out following the setting up of the Commission of Inquiry are certain issues that we need to reflect on as we move ahead. In terms of, after they produced the report, which was then accepted by the President and disseminated, what have they done to date to ensure that they implement some of the recommendations? And who was tasked, if at all, to follow up on those recommendations to ensure that there's implementation? Because we have not really heard much. And now it's almost, very soon it's going to be another year that has passed. Today we are commemorating what happened on 1 August. But it's clear that there's not been any traction in terms of ensuring that at least there's some form of justice, there's some accountability and compensation for the victims. And what, if at all, in terms of accountability processes, can we be looking forward to as human rights advocates, but also as people who are supposed to be supporting the survivors and the victims of the 1 August events? And was the process that was instituted by the Commission of Inquiry victim-centered at all? If it was, then where are we to date? And what can we do going ahead to prevent recurrence of those violations? And of course, as lawyers speaking on behalf of Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, we would really want to see the perpetrators being held to account, but we would also want to see institutional reforms to ensure that those violations will not be repeated again. For now, that's all, Justin.
I will then invite Blessing to talk to us about the process of reparations. Blessing is a human rights lawyer. She also has vast experience in human rights work and handling cases of organized violence and torture. Over to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much. It's quite difficult after
watching such an agonizing documentary, which also made us relive our daily struggles and the experiences we had in the past 7 months, which unfortunately, even up to date, we are still living with the threats and also the fear of the same being repeated upon the citizens of Zimbabwe. I would come in from the perspective of the victims' rights to reparations, which I believe was at the center of the attempts by the Commission of Inquiry to try and come up and hammer on the aspect of what the government is supposed to do regarding the violations that the victims and the families of those that lost their loved ones endured. So our premise is anchored in both the domestic law, that is our constitution, as well as international law, which prescribes that the government has an obligation to make reparations for victims of gross human rights violations. And it's a basic tenet of international law. And when you're looking at it from the perspective of international law, it then calls for four fundamental aspects, which is the right to restitution, the right to compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and another fifth that would add, which actually focuses on ensuring that there are guarantees or assurances to the citizens, and in particular the victims, that the same will not be repeated upon them. And like what Rosa said, it's said that we are here today, 12 months later, we are still living in that fear, we are still living in that agony, and there has not been any attempt by the government to ensure that there is a modicum of assurance that they have changed in their approach, and that citizens' rights and freedoms, the fundamental freedoms which are actually at the core of our own constitution, are continuously being observed. So this is where we are coming in to say that the victims, they have the right to demand reparation in its various forms as it may be applicable in their various circumstances. And it is the government's obligation to make sure that this has been attended to in an expeditious manner.
Thank you, Blessing. And Norman is a public health specialist with experience treating victims of human rights violations. Over to you to give us your opening statement.
All right. Thank you, Justina. From the medical sector, I think the events of 1 August 2018 were something new that we had not witnessed before. And in the medical sector, we're quite caught unaware and unprepared to deal with such levels of excessive force. I remember going to Pararanyatwa that day on 1 August. In the casualty, there was chaos all over. The health professionals there, they actually didn't know how to deal with the victims that were coming there, because most of them, they were actually afraid to attend to the victims, because in the casualty, there were actually some people, men in suit, who were actually standing in casualty and overseeing what was happening. So people were actually afraid to attend to victims at first. And we also witnessed what we could call pressure on some of the health professionals to falsify documents in terms of reports that were coming out. We had victims who were shot, and the report was saying the victim were stabbed. And it had to take lawyers from the NGO Forum and from Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights and the families who kept on pushing pressure for the reports to then come out to say these are victims of the gunshot injuries. I would say that the events that happened, they clearly violated Section 76, which enshrines the right to health for victims, and it also violated Section 48 of the Constitution, which entitles for the right to life. And as you saw from the documentary that we saw, up to now, some of the victims, they are still having pain, they are still facing, they still need continuous treatment, and most of them, they haven't received compensation for the injuries and the long-term disability that they endured due to the violations that occurred on 1 August.
Thank you very much. And as you heard from them through those opening statements, the situation is bleak. Rose, I would want to find out from you, what are the immediate questions that arise from the report of the Motlanthe Commission?
Thank you. Just to pick up from where my colleagues left off, I think some of the critical issues that we need to reflect on is what has been done, if at all, in terms of ensuring that there's justice for the victims, but also ensuring that there's non-recurrence of such violations in future. We then look at whether there have been any reforms, any genuine reforms that have been done by the government, and whether there was really need to just wait for certain reforms, or there were certain actions that could be taken that do not have any cost implication. Because they may be saying that maybe the reforms costly, and since we are facing economic hardships as a country, we will not be able to proceed with certain reforms. So of concern to us, particularly those we have been advocating for a constitution that protects human rights and that has strong institutions, is whether or not there's been respect for the Constitution from 1 August 2018 to date. There are certain provisions of the Constitution that have no cost implication to implement. And these provisions were supposed to be implemented from 2013, when the Constitution came into force in the country. Some of the key provisions that we remain concerned about is the fact that we still get key institutions within government saying that they are not bound by the Constitution. And it's very unfortunate, given that this Constitution, although we say it's not perfect, but we also say it's progressive from what we had, is supposed to be the highest law of the land. And it's disturbing when you get those sentiments from members of the security sector. I'll give an example. A few weeks ago, we visited Job Sikala in prison, and we were advised by the officer in charge that he was not bound by the Constitution. Even when we said, but the Constitution is the highest law. You cannot deny access to lawyers because the Constitution is very clear. He said he was bound by the Prisons Act and the regulations. So what has government been doing since 2013? There are clear obligations in the Constitution for the government to educate, create awareness on the provisions of the Constitution. But it also clearly states that there's an obligation on every entity, on every person, and every institution to respect the Constitution. And you get people in such places of authority saying they are not bound by the Constitution. What have we done to change the mindsets of people within our institutions, particularly the security sector, to know that they are bound by the Constitution? The Constitution is clear. It clearly stipulates who is in the security sector. It also includes intelligence services. We now have regulation of intelligence services in the Constitution for the first time. We have intelligence services. We have the various members of the army, the Zimbabwean National Army, the Defense Forces, the different branches, which even includes the Air Force, the National Army. We have the police service now, which is not supposed to be a police force. And we also have a prison services as part of the security sector. What have we done? And other than just having that strong regulation and those strong provisions on respecting rights, we also have other safeguards in the Constitution around demarcating the various functions of those police sector players. Who does what? Who is responsible for what? But we continue to see the undermining of certain authorities by the other branches of the security services. Can we not just ensure that we implement the provisions of the highest law of the land as a country?
Another question, Rose. We are told that training has started within the police, and I think we have seen them in these new uniforms meant for crowd control. And we are also advised that they have taken delivery of rubber bullets. Is that what we have been expecting in relation to the recommendations of the Motlanthe Commission?
In relation to the recommendations of the Motlanthe Commission, I'm going to restrict it to security sector reform. And if you look at our history as a country, we have gone through various episodes of gross human rights violations. And we have had so many chances. We are still having possibly more chances in future and even now to interact with what we call transitional justice processes as a country. But when you look at transitional justice processes, which other countries have gone through, it's the issue of timing and sequencing. And if we look at timing and sequencing, was it timely and was it properly the right time or the sequencing to buy rubber bullets and that riot gear which makes the police look like Robocop, you know, where they are covered from head to toe? Or was it necessary for the police to invite stakeholders to come up with a framework in terms of how do we implement adequate reforms to ensure that we transform the police, both in terms of behavioral changes, legal changes, the aligning the relevant laws, particularly the Police Act, State Liabilities Act, the Zimbabwe National Army, the Defense Forces Act, and the other relevant laws to the Constitution, which is something that does not cost, there is no cost implication. There is no resources that you need to do that. Just consulting stakeholders after 1 August. But then you see the police and whoever is responsible for that procurement rushing to buy rubber bullets. It's quite clear that they think that the right to assembly and associate and other rights of citizens, they are not paramount. What is paramount is probably safeguarding certain interests. We do agree that in terms of the Constitution, these rights are not absolute. They have to be exercised. Also, striking a balance with rights of others, whether it's right to property, the right to security of other citizens. But in terms of sequencing and timing of whatever we are proposing as reforms, are we consulting the people who are supposed to be benefiting from this service? And from my own perspective, it was very ill-advised. Right now, we are very fortunate that we are sitting with all these lights on. But most of the time, we are spending our time in darkness. We do not even have resources to provide energy to our citizens as a country, but we are diverting resources to buy riot gear. We are devoting our resources to threaten the citizens, to say if you are going to protest, we are going to bring in the military. But what are we doing to implement certain reforms that do not have a financial implication to them? What are we doing to just implement the supreme law that we agreed to, we overwhelmingly voted for, to say, no, this should be our new constitution as a country? So from my perspective, I think it was very ill-advised and it was very premature to do that.
Thank you, Rose. Blessing, August 1, 2018 has happened. What next for the victims? The 6 who lost their lives, and several others who have been permanently injured, and some who have other types of injuries. And in your view, what do you think is adequate compensation? I am not sure if in Zimbabwe dollar, or I'm not sure if we are allowed to talk about US dollars in terms of that compensation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak from the perspective of what we've been observing
in our quest to ensure that the victims have received justice and also they get the legal support they require in this journey. So from our understanding, the what's next question is that, there is no conversation that can be held with the intention of addressing someone's plight without involving them. I think with the Motlhante Commission, the whole idea was perhaps an attempt to bring out what transpired, and the involvement of those that were directly affected by the violence was just to the extent of them coming to give evidence. But I'm sure all those who went and testified, and some that were not even afforded the opportunity to do so, still have this question in their minds to say, so what? They have done what they did, so what? Because they are still going back to their families. They are still going back home. Perhaps you are a child who lost a mother. Perhaps you are a sister who lost a brother. You are still going back to your four walls, living with that agony. There is not even an attempt by the government to extend even a word of encouragement or solace to the victims, which is quite painful. And from our perspective, I think I'll still hammer on the right and the principle to ensure that the victims' concerns are heard. Their right to effective remedies, which is a right that is anchored in our domestic law and also international law, has been guaranteed. I don't see any challenges really why it should take this long for our government. Perhaps tying up to what my colleague Rose said, to say that our government has no culture of, consultation. Sometimes some of these things that may appear like challenges, help is just somewhere, sitting somewhere. It's just a matter of opening up, avenues for dialogue and consultation and get to understand. But be that as it may, we also have a very strong framework of international guidelines and principles. I think one that would come in mind immediately is the resolution of the UN, resolution 60 of 147, on which provided the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparations for victims of gross human rights violations and violations of international law, which emphasize on the obligation of the state to to provide an effective remedy to victims of gross human rights violations. And the understanding of the effective remedy, perhaps to address your question around what can be deemed a fair compensation. I think often the times when we are talking of compensation, we think in monetary terms. But when we are looking at this right to reparations and an effective remedy holistically, it looks at a whole lot of other factors that ensures the dignity of the survivors, the dignity of the families who lost their loved ones, the dignity of the victims who are living with the agony of the violations. And I think at the center of it is, the duty by the state to make sure that it provides an effective remedy. And by effective remedy, I think there are a lot of international guidelines that has been provided for in treaties, in declarations, as well as some of the case law that the government can derive on. But then at the center of it is the victim-centered approach, to say that when you're talking of an effective remedy, how have you involved the victims? How have you ensured that the victims have seen some form of seriousness in terms of the investigations that have been conducted to ensure that the truth is established, those responsible have been made to account, and also in all that process, the victims themselves are part of the process itself. And you're also looking at it from the substantive aspect of it, which is aiming at ensuring that that wrong that we are talking about is not repeated in future. It has been addressed holistically. Unfortunately, when we are looking at the Motlhante framework itself, it was not designed along those international, best standards and principles.
Our view of it was that it was a public relations stunt, which was designed to maybe demonstrate to the international community that we are doing something about it. Hence, after its reports, we are just caught up with the recommendations that the government is not even sure how to implement. And beyond that, there is not even an extension to bring the voices of the victims to find out what they would envisage when we are talking of in particular that recommendation around compensation. I understand there have been a number of pronouncements from cabinet, and recently the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Information, I think Mr. Mangwana, is on record to say that a task force has been established to look into the compensation, and also the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Justice has also been on record to say that a fund has been set aside to provide for the compensation. But our question is, where are the victims in all this? Who has been, involved, who has been consulted to design and understand? Perhaps we're talking of a fund. Maybe that's not what the victims want. So how do we get to establish that as a nation to ensure that these issues have been addressed holistically? So I think I will take it from that angle. Thank you.
Blessing, on another note, we also understand that a framework has been set up where they are saying they will have concluded everything by June 30, 2020. Is that adequate?
Well, in the absence of adequate information and transparency on the part of the government, it will be difficult to even comment, because what we are seeing are just pronouncements. We have not even seen that framework that is being spoken about. I mean, it's one thing to say we have set up a framework, and another to appreciate what that framework entails. What is the methodology? What is the approach? All those issues are still hidden in mystery. But what would assume, or what we would want from our perspective is a framework that puts the victims at the center of everything. I think their participation in all this is key, because at the end of the day, the issue is not to redress what the government thinks was the harm that happened on the citizens, but it's about redressing what the individual victims suffered and experienced as a result of recklessness on the part of state agents, as it were. And what we would hammer on is the fact that the government of Zimbabwe has the responsibility to ensure that the victims have received effective and adequate redress over the violations they suffered in the hands of the state agents, as we openly saw in the documentary.
Norman, as Blessing is talking about the suffering of what the victims went through, I think it's the right time to get you in and also find out the nature of the harm on the victims that you had to deal with as doctors.
Okay. I think the injuries that the victims went through, we could grade them into mild, moderate, and severe. The severe cases were the ones which were mainly due to gunshot wounds, mainly in August and also in January. We had people who had penetrating abdominal and chest trauma, and these were quite excessive and caused permanent injuries to the victims. I can give you an example of a 21-year-old boy who was shot at close range, less than 6 meters, by a uniformed soldier. He had his kidney destroyed, his bladder destroyed, and the bullet went on to hit his spinal cord, and is now paralyzed just at the age of 21. And then you can imagine such level of injuries, which his life has been completely changed. And we also witnessed injuries which we might not call assault, but torture, mainly in January, when the security forces were getting into people's homes and assaulting people, torturing people. We had instances where they would bring sharp objects, pierce people on their souls, beat people until their limbs are broken, um, beat people until they get into what we call severe tissue destruction, such that people went into renal failure and resulted in death. So those injuries were quite excessive, and this resulted in what we call excessive force. So I would say that in general, the force that we used was disproportionate and it was excessive.
And what would you say are the needs of these patients? I think we witnessed the guy who was talking about how a bullet went through his groin and how he now has a permanent injury. What are the needs of these people?
Okay. I would say they can be graded into the impact that the assault and injuries have. They can be graded into immediate impact, short term, and then long term. So the impact that we have in the short term is resulting the death, acute physical pain from injuries, um, and then the short term would say people now start to have disability and incapacitation. As we witnessed in August, people were incapacitated because most of them they were they were vendors in the streets, and we had issues where it was in August and schools were opening, and some of them they couldn't even send their children to school because they didn't have money and they had lost all their property, their their goods that they were selling. And then now in the long term, we have issues of mental illness. People who suffered such kind of trauma, they undergo depression, suicidal thoughts, post-traumatic stress disorder, and they also have anger management. So they really need continuous psychological counseling such that they are not affected by the mental illness that they might get. And we also have to look out for the families of those deceased. They need bereavement counseling. Yes, because right now, as we commemorate, there are pictures circulating again on social media and everything. They are reminded again of the loss of their loved ones. And so they also need a bereavement counseling such that they also do not suffer mental illness. And then also, they also need continuous pain management because from the injuries they get complications like post-traumatic osteoarthritis, which will need continuous pain medication to manage their pain. And also they will, like Blessing have said, they will need compensation as well for the injuries that they
You have just touched on my next question. What do you think, as an expert, in terms of the compensation? Um, what should the victims get in relation to the compensation? You might not have a fixed amount, but I think the things that you have been talking about, I am sure that they are things that are quite expensive for anyone to be able to access.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of compensation, I think it's quite a complex issue which do not have a one correct answer. Um, I think, like Blessing said, we need to involve the victims. They are the ones who know exactly what they want. Because we might think that it's money, but if you talk to the victims, some of them, they just want the perpetrators to be brought to book. For them, they are fine with that. If you imagine the example that I gave you of the 21-year-old who is now paralyzed. There is no amount of money that can replace the loss that have happened to him. So I think it is for the victims themselves to come up with exactly what they think is the best thing that can be given or done to try to compensate the loss that they had.
Thank you, Norman. Blessing, you spoke a bit about accountability. How important is it for perpetrators to be held accountable for what they did?
I would not speak on behalf of the perpetrators. So for me to say how important is it for the perpetrators, I may be found wanting, but I will take it from the perspective of the victim. How important is it for the victims to see those that were responsible for their agony made to account? I think it's part of the, should I say, healing process? It's part of the reparation process. It's part of the right to the effective remedy process. Like I've highlighted earlier on, when you're talking of the procedural component of this right to effective remedy, it emphasizes on the right to fair access to justice for the victims. And it also places an obligation on the state to ensure that those who were responsible are made to account through an effective and impartial investigation, and also that the state itself stands with the victims. So we can't talk of, an effective right to a remedy without the component of those that were responsible being made to account. I think when you're then looking at the other core factor of this right, that is the right that then seeks to ensure that the wrong has been remedied and that there are guarantees of guarantees of non-recurrence. It also places an obligation on the part of the state to ensure that those who were responsible are made to account. I think talking at it from a perspective of our criminal justice system, when someone is being held before the courts and they are going through criminal trial and they are subsequently convicted and the punishment that comes in, it plays a number of, factors or reasons for that. One of it being ensuring that the offenders won't repeat the same, I think, in future. So it's also premising on that. You can't then talk of justice when nothing has been said to those that were responsible. You can't then talk of institutional reform when there has not been any measures that ensures that those who are at the forefront of perpetrating human rights violations are made to account and they don't belong to the same system that should be protecting human rights. And by the same variance, you can't talk of, a right to compensation when someone has not been made to account for the wrongs that they have caused. So I think it's very important and it's very critical. And in the light of the August 1 events and also the subsequent events of January food riots, crackdown, our call to the government is that we have not forgotten and we will do the best we can to ensure that those who were responsible are indeed made to account.
Thank you, Blessing. And Rose, before I turn to the House, if they have any questions, I would want to find out from you, where should the line be drawn between law enforcement and safeguarding peaceful assembly and association? And do these rights have a future in Zimbabwe? The right to peaceful assembly and association.
Thank you, Justina. Yeah, it's a very, very difficult question, and also it will be very difficult for me to predict whether these rights will have a place, but I believe that as a country that is committed to ensuring that we move towards an open democracy, we'll do what we can, and I hope that in the near future, government will engage stakeholders, particularly the citizens, in terms of how do we protect the provisions of the Constitution that we adopted and agreed to. But where do we draw the line? I think it's a very difficult question there, because on the one hand, we have the right to peaceful assembly, and also we have a right to petition in the Constitution. And yet, when you look at the Constitution, you also have a provision that says these rights are not absolute. You have to exercise them with due regard to rights of others. On the other hand, you also have the same Constitution saying that we have certain institutions in the security sector that are supposed to be upholding and respecting the Constitution, maintaining law and order, but also ensuring that citizens are able to enjoy their rights. So one of the questions that has been addressed by other international courts, particularly the European Court on Human Rights, when they've been faced with some of these cases against certain countries, has been the issue of when does the right to protest become against the provisions of international instruments, because international instruments clearly state that it should be peaceful. A protest can start off as a peaceful protest, and then it is hijacked by undesirable elements and it turns violent. But still, those who are engaging in the peaceful protest have a right to continue with their peaceful protests. But if you also look at provisions of domestic laws and even international human rights instruments, you have law enforcement that has certain obligations of maintaining law and order. On the one hand, they're supposed to be ensuring that the peaceful protesters are able to continue with their exercise of the right to protest and assemble, but they are also supposed to also then contain the rowdy elements that may be preventing those who want to assert their rights peacefully from continuing to assert their rights. And if we look at the situation that we are in as a country, it's very unfortunate that we do have a constitution that tries to address some of these issues and ensure that we can draw the line in a way that ensures that the constitution is upheld, the rights of citizens are also promoted and respected. We have an outstanding provision that has not been implemented since 2013, and it's very unfortunate that this is almost going to be the 6th, 7th year since we adopted that constitution, around establishing a civilian, an independent complaints mechanism that then receives complaints where there is misconduct and other violations by the security agents, which has not been implemented. We are supposed to be having a law by now, but we do not have a law. Unfortunately, we see the state prioritizing acquiring ammunition and other riot gear to be able to actually use disproportionate force against citizens asserting their rights. And then you have it on record publicly where you have high-ranking government officials, including a minister, saying that we are not going to hesitate to use the military if you protest. They are not even saying that we are not going to hesitate to protect your right to peaceful assembly, but they are saying if you protest, it's a warning that you cannot even protest, we're going to use the military. And the constitution is clear that we have a military with a certain mandate and certain obligations in terms of protecting the sovereignty of the country and protecting the citizens. And then you have a police service that is supposed to be serving the public and ensuring that they enjoy their rights. So going ahead, we really need to think critically and move with speed in terms of setting up some of these institutions as a country and consulting citizens in terms of what reforms are needed, but also ensuring that we just comply with the constitution and we ensure that the institutions that we have played their different roles and mandates, complementing each other, but in such a way that we do not have disproportionate force being used against citizens and violations of rights of citizens, particularly the right to life, even the right to health, and other rights that citizens are supposed to be enjoying to assemble and protest peacefully, but also we have an obligation as civil society and as citizens to respect the constitution, because our rights are not absolute. There are other people who have other rights too in the constitution that may not want to associate with your protests or your petitions. They have their right to property, they have their right to security, but as responsible citizens, how do we assert our rights in a peaceful way? How do we have due regard to rights of others? It's a conversation that we continue to encourage, that is civil society and as citizens, how do we continue to find each other together with the security service? Because if you really look critically, they have an obligation to protect the citizens. Citizens are paying taxes to be protected and not to have their rights violated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the House, and if anyone has a question for the panelists, now is the time.
a shining light here, so I can't see at the back. Any questions or inputs that people might have? Please, can you identify yourself when you get the mic? And where you are coming from and who you are directing your question to?
Thank you so much. My name is Mo Blessing Matsikatire. I'm an intern student at National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. My question is directed to, I think, all of you as a panel. In terms of justice, since you started the panelist, you were talking about retributive justice. And my question was, what can we do to make sure that justice is really served? Because at the end of the day, after the 1 August shootings, at the end of the day, what we want is to restore the relationship that we have between the citizens among themselves, and also among the government and the citizen. So what are we going to do to make sure that we have restored the relationship between the two institutions, to make sure that we avoid the recurrence of the same problems in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take about 3 to 5 questions in the first round.
My name is Love Gemnis. I'm one of the August 1 victims. My question is, apart from compensation, is there any assistance that we can get? Like initially, I still have a bullet in my right buttock. Apart from the compensation, is there any way that I can be helped so that the bullet can be removed? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Lloyd Kuvea from Amnesty International. I'd like to thank the panelists for a very rich and informative discussion. I just want to zero in on the issue of compensation. Now, I think in our country we have a history of commissions whose recommendations are not implemented. One can go back to, can even mention the Achiambakwe Commission, on Kukuraundi, the Ziramasanga Commission on Education, and other commissions that have been held. So it's worrying that, again, it seems like we might not even have implementation after the Kgalema Motlanthe Commission of Inquiry and their recommendations. What can we as civil society do to ensure the enforcement or recommendation of some of the implementation and enforcement of some of these recommendations, particularly on compensation? And can any of the independent commissions be involved in ensuring that the implementation happens? Thank you very much. Any of the panelists can answer.
Thank you, Lloyd. Any other questions before I ask the panelists to respond to those?
My name is Alison Charles. My brother Gavin Dean Charles is one of the deceased. His daughter is in high school. My question is, we've heard a lot of talk since 1 August, and all it's been is talk. There's nothing solid that's happened. These children need to go to school. People need help. They need assistance. Her mother is struggling to pay school fees. What then is going to happen, mapping a way forward? Who can we go to ask for help?
Thank you. Any other? Thank you, Alison, for that. And I think we had the other person as well. Okay, there's another question at the back.
Mamkasei.
Tamuka.
Indonzi Western Kasiani I'm a peace-loving Zimbabwean. 1 August events will go down as one of the most dreadful things we've ever witnessed, especially for us, the so-called born freeze, the generation here about 39 years. My plea is a plea, organization yenyu, chicha kwanisa kutiitirawo so that we are down to the grassroots, so that one receive counseling, because the events are so traumatized. So good up to now, tototya kufamba kunze, because like yesterday, the whole town engekazara masoja, and you could tell that they are ready for something. So my plea is, what are you going to do as an organization to come down to the grassroots level so that we can receive counseling? Because I feel this is the beginning of greater things to come. It's going to be worse.
Thank you so much for those questions. I'll now revert to the panelists, and I will start with Rose. You can just pick where you would want to respond, and I will go around.
Thank you. Just maybe to start off with the first question that was raised around how do we restore the relationship between the law enforcement and the other members of the security services with the citizens. It's very unfortunate that nothing much has been done to restore that relationship, but most of the utterances and the commitments that have been made is to put further strain on that relationship. It's unfortunate that a few weeks, and I think as far as last week, we still get threats from those that are commanding those security sector players to say, if you do this, we are going to do this to you. We are going to use the army, we are going to unleash the army which is trained to kill. It's very unfortunate. And we are also concerned that maybe more could be done by some of the more neutral, particularly institutions that are supposed to be advancing certain rights, and they've certain mandates in the Constitution, to try and see if there can be dialogue between the citizens and some of the institutions that are involved. I would probably also maybe hasten to call on the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission to say what can be done so that there is dialogue. Civil society has tried to reach out to the police. Following 1 August, we have reached out. There was a report that we sent, and we even invited them for dialogue, but there's been no response on their side. But we'll continue to push, because we do believe that the Constitution provides a framework where we can actually engage certain institutions and where we can try and see if we can find each other as a country. So as a starting point, how can we create a conducive environment for us to be able to communicate the issues and needs? And also for the state institutions that are supposed to be there to protect citizens, to actually engage the citizens. We have not seen any change in mindset of the police service, for instance, and even the state security sector departments such as the military. How can we find each other with these institutions? How can we have dialogue? And as civil society, we are willing to have that dialogue. We are willing to contribute to some of the reforms. We've been engaging institutions like Parliament to say no, in terms of the Constitution. Can we not operationalize Section 210 of the Constitution? And that's as far as we can go, but we'll continue to call on these engagements with these institutions. And maybe just to also respond to Alison, it's very unfortunate that there's been a lot of talk and no action, particularly by certain key officials in government, where they are saying they're going to be implementing some of the recommendations, particularly the compensation. And as players from civil society, I think we can see how we can also continue to engage those institutions and what other action we can assist you in taking to try and ensure that the dependents of the victims of 1 August have their rights respected. Because they have a right to ensure that if they are going to be going to school, their upkeep is taken care of. And in terms of the law, when there's a wrongful death, those who are responsible for that wrongful death, they can actually be held accountable in terms of paying a certain amount of damages to ensure that the dependents or the survivors of the victim can continue to enjoy the rights and the privileges and the benefits that they would have if whether it was the breadwinner was still alive. So there's that option that we also need to explore to see how far this can go, and also how far the other institutions that are there, the Human Rights Commission, the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, can also step in to see that some of these recommendations around compensation, ensuring that the victims' dependents continue to enjoy their way of life, are respected by those that are responsible for that.
Right. Yeah, I would just build up on what Rose has already said. More blessing. I'm glad that you are intending with the NPRC, and most of the things that you are highlighting are actually part of the mandate of the very institution that you are intending with. And I would perhaps clarify that our emphasis is not just on retributive justice. We also spoke about restorative justice. When you look at it from the holistic meaning of the right to reparation, it doesn't just focus on retribution, but it focuses on the key aspects of restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and guarantees for non-recurrence. So I think within that, you broaden up your understanding around it. And having said that, I think maybe the emphasis that we placed on the need for accountability is the one that perhaps made you think that our emphasis is just on retributive justice. I would still underscore that accountability is still critical when you are looking at the aspect of justice and cannot be disregarded. How can we ensure that we restore the relationship between the state? I think building up on what Rose has just said, my thinking would be that the state itself should stop treating citizens as subjects. They should start viewing us as right holders. And as they always say, that trust is earned, is not demanded. They also have an obligation to ensure that they make every effort that they earn the trust that they should get from the citizens. So far, what we are seeing does not build up to that. The key components of participation by citizens have completely been disregarded. I'm sure you've been following up on the recent policies whereby you just go to bed and the following morning you wake up, you are told that we have removed the currency. And when you went to bed yesterday, you had made deals that, that had some implications on your life. And all of a sudden, you wake up at 6 a.m., you are being forced to change your way of life. That's not how you get trust from citizens. You are actually building up the fissures and the fractions that are there. So I think our constitution as an integral document must be respected by both the state and the citizens. Having said that, emphasizing on the obligation of the state to ensure that they put measures and make actions that ensure that citizens trust the state, which I believe at the moment, I'm sure I will leave you to conclude where the levels of trust are. And in terms of compensation, Lovejoy, I'm glad that these things are coming up. And surely when you look at the findings and the recommendations by the Motlanthe Commission, they failed to appreciate that the victims are not a generic group. People have different needs. They suffered violence at different levels. So the reason why we are saying you can't just come up with a framework for compensation without involving the very, people who should be the drivers of that process, who are the victims themselves, is that it may be devoid of merit or legitimacy on the part of the victims. Indeed, when you're looking at the right to an effective remedy and the right to compensation, it should be fair, adequate, and just under the circumstances. And with that understanding, it should incorporate all the needs that a particular victim as a standalone, entity is also, looking forward to. That would also touch up to your remark, Alison, as well. Lloyd, what measures can be taken to ensure that the various recommendations by the various commissions are implemented? I think it's left to us, both civil society and citizens as well, because we are the right holders. We are the people who are affected by whatever issue that these commissions will be looking at, And we have the urgency to demand for accountability from the government itself. And there are various methods, one of which is what we are doing now. And of course, yes, Rose will be the proponent of that, strategic impact litigation. It's also an avenue that as citizens, we can explore, and we have that right, and as enshrined in the Constitution. Of course, lobby and advocacy, we cannot leave that out. We have independent commissions that are created in our Constitution, whose main mandate is to ensure, democracy, good governance, and human rights. And this is at the core of their work. They should also be not silent when these things are happening. They have an obligation to the citizens of Zimbabwe to ensure that whatever has been said in a commission of this nature that relates to the enjoyment of human rights of the citizens of Zimbabwe have been enforced and implemented. Weston, I think that one is actually a key aspect that we are taking forward in our work, the need for counseling in the communities after a trail of destruction has been left and the trauma that communities are being living with. I see Dr. Love Mo is around. I'm sure she has taken note of that. But having said that, again, I'm not sure if we have representatives from the independent commissions as well. I notice the intent from NPRC, but it's also a message that we are giving to you because it's an issue that is also at the core of the mandate of the NPRC. I'm sure you are hearing it for yourself from the affected people themselves. So when you're talking of national healing and reconciliation, it should come down to the experiences of the communities. What is it that they want, and what are the experiences and the kind of issues that they are living with? I think I would leave it there.
Yeah, I think my response would be to, is it Loveness who, Lovejoy, okay, who talked about still having a bullet and still need assistance. I think in terms of having a bullet inside a human body, of course it needs to be taken out, but the key issue is it needs to be taken out safely. And I think the judgment from the medical team that attended to you last year was that it was not safe to do so at that moment. But it doesn't remain like that for life sometimes. Sometimes the bullet moves and changes positions, and it can be safe for it to be removed. So what needs to be done is to have a repeat imaging scans again to see and to have them reviewed by specialist doctors to see if it is now safe to have it removed. So on how you can do that, I think you can get in touch with me after that, and then I can tell you how we can facilitate to have that done. And that also goes to any of the other victims who are in here who still think that they still have mental or physical problems that they are experiencing. You can get in touch with me afterwards, and then we can see how we can assist.
Thank you. And then Alison and Lovejoy, I would also want to say, in a conversation with the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Information, I was informed that there's a bridging fund that is supposed to respond to immediate needs. And I'm told that this fund is being run by the Ministry of Public Service, Labor and Social Welfare. So maybe it might be something that we might need to be able to follow up on and see in terms of what assistance you can be able to get. Any other questions? This will be the last round. I don't see any hands, unless I'm blinded by the light right in my eyes. Okay. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming in. And we still say, as the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, we have not forgotten. And I hope that we are not going to count another 12 months where nothing is going to happen in relation to the victims that are known, that have also been identified even in the Motlanthe report.
allow me at this stage to thank my